The 2019 Global Business Services Investment Conference and Awards event took place in Durban, South Africa from the 19th to the 21st of November. This conference, hosted by BPESA, the South African Department of Trade and Industry, and the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Government, was intended to showcase South Africa's value proposition as a delivery destination for global business services. The program focused on the depth and breadth of service capability, the quality of skills of the youth, and the competitive opportunity for South Africa and continental Africa in the digitally enabled market for global services. The ubiquity of the digital economy has disrupted traditional management and leadership models. Trust is placed more and more in data, social networks, and one's peer group. This keynote address you're about to hear unpacks the implications for leadership in the digital economy and looks at how trust will be earned and retained. Here is Philipp Kristian Diekhöner from the Oxytocin Group talking about the trust economy.
Trust. Big word, right? But what does it actually mean? What are you going to talk about? And the reality is that there's so much more to trust than you may immediately recognize. And I'll go through how that affects our day-to-day lives, how it affects anything from the countries we invest in, hint, to the people we hang out with. Trust is super crucial, and in fact, it's a force as well of change that we're going to see in the world. So, really, if you want to take one major thing away, and I'll remind you of this later on, is this little nice thing. Trust drives our behavior because trust is an emotion, and our behaviors are usually driven by emotions, interestingly enough. And behavior, of course, drives our choice. Behavior decides what we're going to do, where we're going to be. It decides whether I'm going to be in South Africa or in Malaysia or somewhere else. And that choice creates the future. It's that simple. So if you think that, the future is complex or weird, it's this simple. The decisions that we collectively make, they create the future. And I want to make very sure that the decisions you make coming out of this event are decisions that create a bright future for this country. So let's start with a very uniquely Afrikaans thing, which is that, basically there is this default trust. There's this huge amount of trust, and I think it's very, very much part of this culture. And I learned this from a South African who was telling me, basically, trust is really how we do business. And it's always been part of that. And I love that because, as you may see, trust actually makes things a lot more simple, right? When you can trust somebody, life gets a lot easier, and you don't have to think so much. And you need less process and less bureaucracy to get the job done. And that's quite brilliant because all of us want that. All of us want to work in an easy business environment. And trust is a very, very important point in this. Some of you may know I've flown in from Singapore. Singapore is another country that most certainly has achieved a certain edge of trust. And I think that there's no question that that has a huge benefit. So I believe putting trust first on a nation level, on a country level, and on a people level is the right thing to do, and it's going to make us all proud. So, moving to the nature of trust. I don't know how many of you are fans of Star Wars, but maybe you're familiar with the Force, right? Yeah? We know the Force? Vader and all that? Okay, cool. So the thing with the Force is, right, the Force is neither good or bad. The Force is just neutral. It's just the Force, basically. But what we use it with and what we use it for is much more important. And it's the same with trust, mind you, because trust is not good. It's not a feel-good emotion. Trust is neither good or bad. Trust is just a force of decision-making. And therefore, it's a force of economic development as well. Trust is about value. You may argue with me whether this product is good for your health. But some people may believe that it creates happiness for them. Point is, trust is about value. And what we trust products, services, people, and countries to do is about the value that they provide to us. And this is important as we think about, the bigger picture as to how we develop, what we're going to develop, and how our country will prosper. So the way I define trust is really that trust is kind of value, first of all, but it's value that we realize through the interactions we take part on every day, like the interactions that we do in business, because ultimately our world is nothing more than the interactions we have with other people. Right? And there's quite a lot of people in this world, so there's quite a lot of interactions for us. Basically, trust is nothing else than the value that we realize through these interactions. So I'm defining it very closely to economic and social capital, and this is consistent with some of the research that's coming out on trust. that trust is far more than just a sentiment or an emotion in itself, but it's actually a driving factor in how we behave, what we do, and the kind of future that then results. So when we look at that, I'd like to implant in you this idea that collective trust is probably the most important economic power that there is. And to put it in a different way, collective distrust is one of the most damaging things that we can experience. We know this because stock markets are ultimately driven by sentiment. And sentiment is nothing else than trust in future value. And when we look at some of the world's tech companies, we recognize that they have a huge amount of trust capital on their side. This is capital that reflects in stock prices, but it also reflects in the ability for some of these companies to build really interesting infrastructure without having to turn a profit every quarter. And I find that interesting because if there's one thing we want for a nation and for companies, it's trust in the future. And trust has a lot to do with the ability to look long term. But it also is important to understand that most businesses will face short-term realities, right? We all need to eat, we need to make a living. And so my perception on trust is that I believe trust can harmonize between the long-term and the short-term goals. And as far as I understand the economy, that's one of the biggest challenges most people will face. How do we succeed in the short term without cutting corners so that the long term suffers? And to me, trust will be a narrative that will allow you to look at your very familiar business world in a different way and look at understanding how trust matters to us as individuals on a broad, macro, global level and everything in between. So really, when we talk about being trustworthy, if you're in financial services or if you're in investment, trustworthiness is probably something that you care about, one way or another. But trustworthiness is only valuable when trustedness is also there. So there are certain technology companies that have made bad headlines in the past, and they certainly have been trusted because we entrusted them with our data, our money, and our time. But there is a legitimate question as to whether they are trustworthy. And this goes through everything in our life. If we don't think the water that we drink is safe, it's very, very hard to get by in life, right? If we don't think that the technology we use is safe, it's very, very hard to get by. But this is not so much a question of whether it's something worthy of being trusted. It's more a question of whether we actually behave in such a way that we trust it. So to me, it's important, of course, to encourage us to be both. But if we are trustworthy without being trusted, we're missing out. And so the reality is that life gets very complex without trust. If you've tried, to second guess every interaction you have, every step you go, it becomes very difficult for you to live. So I wouldn't necessarily say that trust is a nice to have thing that we add on top of all the important stuff. Much rather, it's a foundation that's absolutely essential. And the more of that foundation, the better. So without trust, life gets very complex indeed, because if we were to second guess everything we do, it adds a lot of bureaucracy and pain to our lives. And that means ultimately, when we look at the business world right now, global business complexity has never been higher. And we can reasonably expect that to continue to be so. In fact, if there's one major development over the last decade, is that the intricateness of the economy, global connections have become more and more. So there is this incredible complexity that we have to manage. And here's the thing. Most of us, one way or another, struggle with that complexity. Because complexity makes it very, very hard to be administered. And it leads to a lot of friction. It leads to a lot of ultimately necessary administration. And it means that things take a long time. But complexity is not something that is going to leave this world anytime soon. So what rather needs to change is the way that we manage for it. And again, trust has an important message here, because if we look at the world we live in, we're living in this world of necessary distrust, an inflationary necessary distrust. We have fences, we have security checkpoints, we have background checks, and we have long legal documents. I'm sure all of you know what I'm talking about because we deal with it on a daily basis. These are necessary vehicles for us to get by in our day-to-day lives as we do business. But the reality is that they constrain us. None of us, as people individually, want these things. We just accept that we need them. And so to me, if we really want to bring transformation to an economy and to the world overall, we need to understand how we can move from this inflationary distrust towards a world in which we can be more trusting and trust first. And this is important because I didn't make this up. There are many established statistics on how productivity is being stifled by distrust. Meaningfully, that from the 50s to the 2000s, what we're seeing is a decrease in annual productivity amendments, meaning that every year the productivity we gain becomes lesser. And I don't know about you, but I think that's slightly concerning because whilst there has been this sort of productivity growth ceiling, at the same time, you know the technology curve, right? The technology curve has been more of a hockey stick. And what this tells me, and I don't really make a very sophisticated analysis, but what this does tell me, and anybody who looks at such a graph, is that for some reason we're not reaping the benefits of technology as much as we could. Or at least we could be doing more. And the real reason for that is that we have too many rules that get in the way of getting things done. For example, nowadays, an average decision maker takes way more time and influences way more people until a deal is signed. Now that may be nice, but in actual fact, it just leads to us losing speed in the global economy. And that ceiling which we're hitting is not a good thing because it means that we're constantly going to be stifled by the complexity that we face around the world. The more complexity there is, the more distrust there is, we're ultimately leading us to a dead end. And I believe that technology companies, whether we like them or not, have actually shown that there's a better way. And have actually returned us to an environment where we can trust. Because as trust sort of to a certain extent leaves institutions, we're seeing it move where? To interfaces, to data, and to technology. And again, if you think that trust is the force, if you accept that, this is neither good or bad. This is simply happening. So as we sort of start moving our lives onto interfaces and the data and technology behind them, somebody's gaining a lot of things here. But it really shows us that also, the tech boom has created a behavior change that is quite profound. Because technology helps us scale trust like never before. If you wanted to build trust with a lot of people, you know this. I'm assuming not all of you know every single one person in your LinkedIn network, right? I certainly don't. And this is interesting because there's maybe like 150 to 200 people that you can consciously form ongoing relationships with that would be persistent. Now, that's not exactly what we call scale. Yet, technology through platforms like LinkedIn and marketplaces allows us to establish this notion of trust with each other and allows us to reach out to people even if we haven't necessarily reached out to them in a long time. But the point is here that technology allows us through reputation systems like ratings, through peer-to-peer reviews, to actually build relationships at scale and to create trust capital at scale. And this is very interesting because when we're looking at a world right now that is empowered by technology, we will soon also see that this is a world that's more decentralized than our current world. And this decentralized economy means that we may actually have even more complexity to deal with than already today. So the only way to manage that really is to use technology to help us scale the trust that we have between people, between each other, to an economic level, so we can all benefit. So really what's happening, and I'm sure this is happening to all of you as well, is that we get into cars piloted by strangers. We sleep in strangers' houses. You know the story. We do things that our parents, or at least my parents, would have very much cautioned me to do. And we do them very willingly. In fact, if you look at Southeast Asia, again, very good example for how, even in a country like Indonesia, Gojek has made a huge difference to safety of individuals because it allows people to have a lot more certainty in their daily commute. Gojek is like Uber, but it's sort of a local version. The amount of uplift that is created and the amount of opportunity and empowerment that is created is quite remarkable. And it's done this in an economy where, distrust is quite common. So really what's happened is that technology has created a trust layer on top of societies. The same is happening for China. And I think we can learn a lot from that because there's a lot of benefit that gives us. And there's a lot of infrastructure that we can use that is built by interesting technologies that we can use to actually develop and to do more. And so what's really happening is that we are trusting interfaces more than ever. In fact, if you're in the BPO space, you may have noticed that there is a spike in chat. That chat is becoming an important medium. Now, chat is ultimately the perfect example for how something is flowing to interface, how interface is becoming important. And some of you may be aware that nowadays it's no longer about a single channel, whether it's voice or interface, but it's much more about orchestration of different channels into one data platform. Why? Because the handover needs to be perfect. And the more complex the requests from your customers or from the people on the other side of the end of the line, the more important it is to actually have a good data trail. Because the data trail will make life easier for the people that actually have to, build relationships and solve problems. So what we're seeing is that this interface revolution is not just about us booking a ride through a Gojek or an Uber, but it actually is changing the way that, corporations and businesses ultimately orchestrate themselves and the way they ultimately go about their business. So what we're seeing as a result of that, and this is something I'm truly passionate about, is that all this interface revolution and the facility of building trust online has actually made us bring back relationships into work. Now, I've never met a person who says relationships don't matter. And I've never met a person who says I don't want relationships at work. But with our globalized society, it's not always possible to take the time to get to know people personally and to work on a basis of shared trust. However, what really has happened through technology is that we've been able to build relationships faster and more reliably than ever before. And so if you hear stories about the global economy becoming more anonymous through digitization, I find that the opposite has happened. And I find that we can be very optimistic about how technology is just giving us opportunity to connect with each other again on a level where we're comfortable to engage with people from everywhere. And I think this is driven by a generational change as well. And of course, me representing the younger generation, I have a few things to say about that. But I love the fact that this is happening, and I think it's doing us a lot of good. So maybe you have seen this quite inflammatory comment by The Economist that data is the new oil. I'd like to make you think a little bit differently in this context, because of course, data powers a lot of our interactions today. And therefore, it's much more like the new nuclear power. Because data, again, it has a lot of good to offer. But the reality is when all our lives are digitized to a certain extent, when our interactions are digitized, what happens when that data gets into the wrong hands, right? The problem with the data economy is that once data leaves any system, it's impossible to get back. So once you've provided data and that leaks, it's very, very hard to actually regain control of it. So we're not looking at the new oil. We're looking at a force that is too big to ignore, but also too dangerous to just manage haphazardly. And we need to understand how data can be to our benefit and how it can actually help us amplify our humanity rather than decrease it. So this interface revolution we're facing, it has a few characteristics I'd like you to think about. First of all, it's trust first. We trust before we assume that something doesn't work. There is way less skepticism online, for better or for worse. It's personalized because data enables that. It's very inherently digitally empowered because interfaces allow us to do things much faster, much simpler, with greater convenience. And it's driven by simplicity. Because when you look at the world as complex as it is, nobody says, oh, I love complexity. I love it that the world is so complex. Whenever I do my yearly accounts, I'll tell you, I wish simplicity was more part of my day-to-day life. I find it incredible. And I think there is a drive for simplicity. Just imagine how much more productive your people would be if they had a simpler work environment. If we spent less time on doing contracts, less time on administration, how much more productive could we be as a society overall? So to me, the solution of technology is not about replacing people. It's about augmenting people. And this is consistent, for example, with the CEO of one of the world's largest tech companies who basically said that human augmentation is the way forward. You may have an idea who that is. I'm not going to give it away. But basically, the idea of technology is never to replace humans, because then what would we be doing, right? I think the real point here is that technology has a story to offer based on trust, which is beneficial for all of us. And that's the story I'm trying to tell today. But before I'm telling that story, obviously, there'll be different generations in this room. And whenever I have a conversation with people in my network, there's very, very different attitudes that we have towards data and technology. This is fundamentally a generational conversation because us folks have grown up with the internet. The Gen Z folks have grown up with smartphones as really the default way of engaging with the world. Of course, that influences what they trust and how they behave, right? In fact, I was speaking to this a friend of mine who said, I sometimes have to explain to my Gen Z daughter that there is actually a world outside the smartphone. That exists. Which to a few older folks might be quite logical, but to some of us, it's not. So attitudes differ. And one of the things we see with baby boomers, right, really kind of the oldest generation represented at work, is that people still believe that handshakes matter more than tech. Tech is sort of this distraction that is happening on the side. And data is the necessary evil in order to get our decisions through. So we'll just use a bit of data just to make sure that we're on the mark. And then you enter Gen X, which is probably the vast majority here. We love rules. Gen X loves rules. And tech is kind of this tool set. We've accepted that tech is a tool we need to use. But data is our insurance policy, really. So we make our decisions, and then we hire a consulting firm to give us statistics, and then we're on the safe side. We're good here. Like they've endorsed that conversation. The Gen Ys are slightly different. The Gen Ys are more of a generation of Google first and think second, kind of. And there, really, technology is becoming a lot more of an enabler. And the data that these individuals share is very much a currency. I give data, I get something back. I get personalization back. I get utility back. Now, it's super important to understand that in a young country, in a country that's evolving, and in a country that's full of enthusiasm, the young generation, as anywhere, has a huge role to play in shaping the future. And I think the Gen Ys and Gen Zs will show us a different way, and it's our job collectively also to embrace it. Because when we come to the youngest generation, really digital is reality for them. Right? That's the first reality for them. That is the way they experience the world. And the technology is the infrastructure that they use to make sense of the world, with data being the context for them to interpret what's going on in their lives. This may be slightly scary to some of you, but actually it's really fascinating because it's perfectly logical. When an entire infrastructure and value is ultimately coming online and being transferred to tech interfaces, it makes perfect sense for people to consider that the primary way of engaging with the world. In fact, I don't know if you've heard of this, but in China they now actually have lanes for people walking with smartphones because there were collisions with lampposts and other things. This is a legitimate problem in Asia, and it's a problem that I'm quite passionate about because this might have happened to me as well once. So this is very interesting. It's certainly behavior that we're seeing. And as part of that, you as a parent may say, this is actually problematic. We've reached an age of overtrust, right? In fact, I like to say it this way. If somebody on the street came to you and said, hey, I have this new startup, here's a $5 voucher, can I have your credit card now? Most people will say, are you insane? Of course not. Yet that very same behavior we do on a daily basis online. We see a nice ad, oh, $5 voucher, I'm going to put in my credit card details. Why? We are using technology and convenience in a form of overtrust. And this is spearheaded very much by the young generations. But don't blame them just yet. Understand where they're coming from, okay? Because we're seeing this incredibly interesting tech trust paradox. So technology and trust is very different for all of us, even in our private lives, compared to work. In private, what happens really is that we trust technology too much. It's not just the youngsters, we all do this. We're too fast, we're too transparent, there's a lot of oversharing going on, right? And we have too much willingness to ultimately provide our data. Now, the reason this is happening is because the world has changed faster than the world of work. In the 90s, there's a saying that the computer you would have had in your workplace was way more cutting edge than the stuff you could afford at home, right? Am I right? For those who were at work in the 90s, it wasn't me, somebody else, maybe, because I was too little for that time. But I did get my first computer in 97. It was a 33 megahertz computer. I was very proud of it. That was great. The thing is, that's changed, right? Nowadays in the workplace, actually our technology is pretty much still 90s. It's kind of stuck there. But in kind of our day-to-day lives, we use AI-powered equipment, we use drones, we do all this stuff, and it's perfectly normal. Don't even think about it twice. This shows us that there's something that needs to change about the way we organize our workplaces. And we need to battle three things. One is, too little trust in tech, too fragmented decisions, too slow and intransparent processes, and too little willingness to share. We call this politics. I think, in organizations, we all have to deal with politics. And politics can be good or bad. We all know this, right? They can be good to drive change, or they can be bad and ultimately keeping us where we are. This is interesting because workplaces are, of course, how the economy grows, right? If our workplaces deliver more value, guess what happens to the world around us? So by using technology in private, we're improving our day-to-day lives, but we're not improving the future of our nations and countries and people. We need to do this at work as well. And this is difficult because most leadership frameworks are not built for this, especially not for the entitlement with which the young generation is trying to take charge. And I treat this with the largest of optimism. I think this is brilliant. But it's very, very hard for people to cope. There's a classic leadership conversation going on between a Gen X and a Gen Y. The Gen X person believes that trust has to be earned before it's given. The Gen Ys will say, trust has to be given until I prove them otherwise. So basically, as a Gen Y, I would expect trust to be given up front, because that's what technology does. And you can imagine the amount of friction that happens at work when I have a manager that's unwilling to trust somebody, and that person doesn't understand why they're not being trusted because they haven't done anything wrong. That is your conversation that's happening all around the world, in all kinds of companies, in all industries. I've seen this in Asia, I've seen this in the US, I've seen it in Europe. I'm pretty sure we're seeing it here too. And this is interesting because it means that we really need to understand each other better. And we need to understand that as intergenerational leadership challenges will surface, this is not about whether this way is the right way. It's just about the fact that we all have different trust attitudes, and we really need to be aware of those. That's what's happening. And I think this has a lot to do with empowerment, because the younger generation uses technology far more to its potential to empower us than maybe some of the more skeptical folks. There are so many tools that allow us to do things decentrally, independently, and with ease and convenience nowadays that has never really happened before in this way. So it's perfectly obvious that a generation which is used to trusting technology and used to trusting people through technology will demand that this happens at work too. And I think this is fascinating because when we start embracing this, our productivity will leapfrog. And in fact, every country in the world will face a productivity issue because of this. Because intergenerational leadership creates a huge challenge because people don't understand each other. This means the handover is not as seamless as it can be. How do we transition from current leaders to future leaders? That conversation needs to be around trust, it needs to be around empowerment, and it allows those individuals to understand the value of trust to really make a difference. So we're on the brink of one of the biggest shifts I've ever kind of come across in history. This incredible socioeconomic shift, moving away from a distrust-first society with healthy skepticism towards a trust-first society where we really establish a much more smooth and streamlined way of interacting. And this is interesting because this means that we're moving our trust medium from rules towards data and decentralized technology and platforms. And our values move from the sort of safe, reliable, and solid to speed, convenience, and informality. This is crucial because this is changing the trust game. Every research nowadays on the future of work indicates that trust is the single most ingredient of high-performing teams. So this is actually a good thing. But it also creates challenges because in order for us to create top-performing teams, innovative teams, we need to create high-trust environments. And high-trust environments, by definition, are volatile and fragile because they can be exploited. So how do we create the systems to be able to create high-trust environments that allow us to be more productive? This is where data and technology can hopefully have an answer for us. Because when we look at the world, right, this is from Charles Schwab, not Charles Schwab, obviously, not the investment company, Klaus Schwab, the chairman of the WEF, who says that in the past, it was the big fish that would win. In the future, it's actually the small fish that can succeed because the faster fish eat the slower fish. When I was in corporate and we were driving transformation, we realized that we were a big fish and that we were not as fast as the small fish. And we realized that we needed to change and we needed to invest in small fish so that we could become faster. This means that if you're an established organization, trust in the old economy doesn't equal trust in the new economy, because the way that trust is built in the new economy is completely and utterly different. And this means we all need to change. 21st century trust building is a paradigm shift. We need to reinvent the way we do this. We need to move from formal and predictable and static-based marble column suits type trust building towards trust building that focuses on humanity, on user centricity, on understanding context, and on being fast. And as much as technology can do part of that, of course, people play a significant role. Now, when I visited Harambee yesterday, the kind of people that I saw were people that were flexible, we're empathy-driven, and we're extremely focused on getting the job done. And those are the kinds of people, respectfully, that I think will be able to drive this change. So there's a gigantic asset that you have here. And I really urge you and the folks of you that are thinking of investing in this place to make use of that, because this is the very heartbeat of the change that we're seeing right now. Before we look at just trust and isolation, I of course want to also address your inner skeptic to say, like, look at how the world would appear if we trust everybody, right? Wouldn't there be anarchy? Isn't that like kind of opening a prison door and telling everybody to stay inside? How is that going to work, right? Isn't too much trust also bad? And here's my response. I hear you. You're absolutely right that that is a challenge. But to me, it's about finding balance. It's about finding balance between too little trust and too much trust. I'll show you examples. You will be very familiar with these. Skepticism makes us trust too little. This comes to cryptocurrency, to any kind of transformational technology where the first thing that happens is regulators go, no, we're not doing this. And institutions go, no, this is going to create all kinds of bad things. And boy, you're right. But the thing is, this is not to deter us from the fact that some technology has incredible promise for our lives. So skepticism, makes us trust too little. And that can be a problem. But the very opposite happens on a day-to-day basis as well, where really kind of convenience will make us trust far more than we should. Let me ask you, what is the biggest lie on the internet? Any ideas? Thank you. Well done. Somebody's paid attention. Somebody knows. This is what happens. I'm pretty sure that if I asked kind of those people in the room to leave who have actually done this without reading the terms and conditions, I'd basically be done here, right? We've all done this. And the reason is that nowadays, as the world moves so fast, we simply don't want to read through 10, 20, 30, 40 pages of legalese. Our attention spans are getting far shorter than ever before. We're much more able to respond to video content than text. In fact, the average person doesn't even read a paragraph anymore. Can you imagine that? Like, what a world, right? Whereas, even if you look at advertising, like in the 50s, it was like this whole page of things describing a product. Now it's maybe like one sentence or two. So there is this incredible change in even how we choose to communicate. And that means, of course, we need speed, we need swiftness, and we need people to understand us intricately. So technology really can just be the enabler. It's the people that make that difference. And there's nothing worse than, explaining your problem to a chatbot and then having to explain that very same problem again to a person. I don't know if you've been there, but in Asia we've had this chatbot wave recently. So what actually happens is you create more bureaucracy and more pain for you to actually get a resolution. To me, that is not the idea. The idea is not to employ technology for technology's sake. The idea is to understand how technology can create a safe and fast way of doing business. And honestly, when you enable people with that, people perform at their peak. And this is the message I want you to take away. Because every day, all of us, all of you, everyone, we vote with our trust for the kind of future that we will create, where we put our money, who we interact with, who we associate with, where we travel. All of these decisions are votes for the kind of future that we want. Because all of them are how we allocate our trust, our capital, our time, and our data. So let's make sure that we understand we are all responsible for this. And collectively, the decisions we make, the decisions we trust will create a future. And hopefully that future will be bright. The way to make it bright is to focus on intuition, to make things intuitive. For the people that enable this industry, there is nothing more important than intuitive technology. If you look at your average technology environment, you'll see that there'll be frictions, there'll be time issues, there'll be, speed issues. What you really want to do to empower people to be at their very best, for this sector to be world-class here, is to ensure that human-technology interaction is intuitive, it's natural, and it's both fast and safe at the same time. Because that is when you start really realizing the peak of what an industry could achieve. And that is also how you future-proof this industry for the technology that will be coming in, because that technology will be able to achieve drastic improvements. And I think, as for anything, there's always an opportunity to leapfrog. In Southeast Asia, we're seeing this with the internet connection. Most societies in Southeast Asia have never had broadband. They're moving straight to 5G. And I think when it comes to behaviors, management practices, and the way we understand technology, and the way we look at trust, every country that has big ambitions has an opportunity to leapfrog. And I'd like to encourage this leapfrogging because it's the way that you can get ahead of whoever is already more established. You know, past success is always the enemy of future success because it creates a precedent. It creates a certain way of doing things. And sometimes we simply have to rethink our ways in order to own the future. So this is why I define innovation very differently than most scholars. And I'm not a scholar. I'm just a person that looks at behavior. I define trust as ultimately an enabler of innovation because it's an enabler of value. And innovation happens whenever trust shifts from a current way of doing things to a new way of doing things. So looking at investment, innovation can happen when trust shifts from a certain destination to another one. And of course, we're here to put a spotlight on South Africa. So to me, if we really look at this in a complete and wholesome way, there is no value without trust, and without value, there can't be any innovation. So it's really important to understand that, we need to be able to trigger a shift of trust and capital and innovation inwards, and that will allow us to thrive. It's really a world in which the most trusted ideas, people, and companies will survive. And in fact, they'll thrive because I would like to think that if I can use trust as a force for good, I want to make sure that the worthiest ideas and the ones that are most inclusive and supportive are the ideas that will actually boil up and the ideas that will create the future. And to me, because we're all in charge of the future, I think this is something that we can all take upon ourselves. It is up to us whether we want to use trust to create more connection with people. It's ultimately up to us whether we want to use trust to create a more inclusive society. And it's up to us whether we want to make the right ideas and the ideas that benefit everybody sort of come to the top and succeed. And I think this is a worthy cause for all of us to subscribe to. This is my way of looking at trust. Of course, as a German, I would have a framework for this, a process. So this is my process. We're looking at kind of how to design and manage for trust. This helps you because you don't have to read my book. I know reading takes time and not everybody's into it. So basically, this is my 6-stage framework for looking at trust. And I firmly believe, this one thing I keep saying is that designing and managing for trust is the single most important thing you can do to thrive in this digital age. So I'm looking at trust as, first of all, a proactive factor where we build the right perception, we create triggers and temptation like incentives in the right way, and then we speak a humane language and we ensure that we build a real connection with people so that they feel comfortable, looking at our trust proposition. An investment proposition is nothing else than a trust proposition. It just shows people why it makes sense for us to be here, why it makes sense to ultimately, extend our footprint here. And then that usually invites a reaction. Everything in communication and trust is reactive and proactive at the same time. So when you put something out there, there will be a reaction. So when this reaction starts, the first thing that will happen is people will hold you accountable to what you do, not just what you say. We've heard this earlier today. Very, very important, the integrity of that. And then once that happens, they'll probably start looking at this market and they'll make their investment, and then it becomes a good business decision. But it's really a passive decision, as in, it's just about sort of starting to make an impact. But what you really want is for people to say, South Africa, this is the place. That's the last stage. That's affiliation, where people see the purpose of what they're doing, where people see the purpose of investing in this country. They see the purpose of what's going on here, and they say to their peers and their networks, this is what you should be doing. Because trust me, and you know this, word of mouth is the most important thing you can have. Word of mouth is the reason that we all thrive. And the ones of us that have the most word of mouth, we know that makes business better, that makes our lives better. Word of mouth is the end game in trust because that spreads the word. It creates the right perception. And that's how this whole thing is a cycle. So basically from affiliation, from the word of mouth part, we're going back to perception. And ultimately this is an upward spiral ideally. So really to kind of give you, a few notes, if you wanted, a few takeaways, the trust economy that I refer to equalizes, it humanizes, and most importantly, it empowers us. From infrastructure, we're looking at flexibility overtaking rigid structures. We're looking at decentralization taking over institutional centralized bureaucracies. This is very important. We're looking at swarms and tribes and small teams taking over established departments and divisions. And we're looking at social contracts between people, contracts based on trust rather than distrust, taking over rules-based compliance. There's a very fascinating takeaway here because actually South Africa is quite leading in the financial services space in doing this, understanding that the right kind of behaviors are more effective at ensuring compliance inside organizations than rules. And I'd like to encourage other sectors, in fact all industries, to adopt the same view. More rules will not lead to more compliance. What you need to do is establish the right culture, because culture is something that enforces itself. It doesn't require enforcement. And if you establish the right business culture in every aspect, specifically in this sector, you will see the benefits. You will see a completely different performance culture, because when the culture is based on trust, people are able to perform at their absolute peak. And why train people, why hire people if you're not allowing them to perform at that peak? And to me, this comes back to using data and technology in the smart way. And I think when we put trust first, data and technology can do wonders. When we put trust last, data and technology will be dangerous. So really, we're looking at building trust-first relationships, being able to go out there in the world with a unique proposition, and basically reducing this distrust epidemic so that we can all be better off, and we can all also feel better about our work. So really, what then happens if you do this well is that trust creates these mental monopolies. That trust has the ability of making us think that one particular destination, one company, or even one person is the best and most qualified to do a certain job. So we move from transactional trust, which is things like, fraud prevention, to contextual trust, which is basically experts, like doctors, to universal trust, which is where a destination, an industry, or an individual is universally trusted to be doing the right thing, and where we associate with that universal idea and where we promote that idea. This is the point I was making about word of mouth. So we are trying to move always towards universal trust, because universal trust allows us to use this trust towards all kinds of different causes. And that universal trust is something that an industry can build. It's a reputation that can be built. And I think when we look at nation-building stories, there is a lot of potential in establishing nations in which we can have universal trust, and in which trust isn't just based on individual activities, but where we can really kind of build a reputation that goes beyond. And I think universal trust is, if you ever believe that your iPhone is better than any of the other technically superior phones, you are falling prey to the mental monopoly problem. It's a very, very profitable place to be, I'll tell you that. And you can use that profit for good. And this is, of course, what I'd like to encourage you to do. Here's the thing. For me, you might be asking yourself, why is this guy talking about trust? If you haven't got it until now, unlike money, trust is a form of capital that multiplies when shared. This is super important. It means that trust is by definition inclusive. And I think inclusion is the one thing that makes us feel great. Equality in business makes us feel great. We all want to build relationships, human connections. We all want to be on the same playing field. And trust enables us to do this far more effectively than capital alone. There's a visionary gentleman that I really follow. His name is Sadhguru, and he says, desire is personal. Desire, like we need something to happen, we need growth, that's personal. But vision is all-inclusive. What's really important here is not just the desire of needing something like growth or like prosperity. It's about what do we do with that. And in this past couple days, I've seen a very nice vision in this country. And it's a vision that I can very much buy into. And I'm honestly very sure that when we all buy into this vision, we can transform the entire situation. And this is also where I see the trust economy building a happier society that is also more prosperous. I'd all like to encourage you to partake. Thank you very much.